Thanks for watching this video from the Bible Fulfilled. My name is Alex Polyak. I am the director of the Bible Fulfilled, and today I'm going to be talking about the millennium, when it begins and when it ends. And by the way, if you don't know what the millennium refers to, it is the 1,000-year period mentioned in Revelation 20, which I'm going to read in a second. So there are different views about the millennium, among Christians. There are actually about 3 main futurist views and 1 preterist view. And if you're not familiar with the terms futurist and preterist, the futurist simply believes that the second coming is still future, and a preterist believes the second coming already happened. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. So there are 3 main futurist views of the millennium and 1 main preterist view. And keep in mind also that there are variations within each of those views. So to try to keep things as simple as possible, though, I'm just going to focus on the 3 main futurist views and then the 1 main preterist view. Okay, so that said, like I said, the millennium refers to the 1,000-year period mentioned in Revelation 20. And I'm going to read that right now. So Revelation 20 says, starts off with, then I, and I is John here. So then I saw an angel coming down from heaven with the keys of the bottomless pit and the great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him to the bottomless pit, shut him up, set a seal on him so that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things, he must be released for a little while. Now, when the 1,000 years have expired, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will go out to deceive the nations which are in the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. They went up on the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. The devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. This is Revelation 20, verses 1 to 3 and verses 7 to 10. I skipped a couple verses just for time. Okay, so this is what the millennium refers to, the 1,000 years that's mentioned in Revelation 20. And again, there are three main futurist viewpoints regarding this 1,000-year time period, and then 1 main preterist viewpoint. So let me start with the futurist viewpoints. The 3 main futurist views of the millennium are Premillennialist, Postmillennialist, and Amillennialist. I made a color-coded illustration to make it easier to understand. Okay, so if you're looking at that illustration, the premillennialists, which are represented in yellow, they believe the millennium begins after the second coming and lasts for a literal 1,000 years. Now, some premillennialists will take a more figurative view on the 1,000 years, but for the most part, most premillennialists believe that millennium is exactly 1,000 years. Now, the postmillennialists, represented in red, say the millennium happens before the second coming. And like premillennialists, postmillennialists take the millennium to be a literal 1,000 years. And then the third view, represented in blue, is amillennialists, and they believe that the millennium refers to the time period between Jesus' first coming and his second coming. So amillennialists believe that we are right now in the millennium. They believe that the 1,000 year is symbolic for the time period between the first coming, which happened, in the year 8030, to whenever they believe the second coming will happen. So far it's been 2,000 years. So those are the 3 main futurist views of the millennium. Now, besides the 3 main futurist views, there is also the preterist view, which is illustrated in green. So preterists agree with the amillennialists that the millennium refers to the time period between the first and second comings. And preterists also agree with amillennialists that the millennium is symbolic, it's a symbolic time period. It doesn't literally refer to 1,000 years. However, preterists believe that the second coming happened in the year 8070. And they based that on passages such as Matthew 16, verse 28, in which Jesus said to his disciples, "Assuredly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death or die until they see the Son of Man coming." Jesus also made similar statements in Matthew 10:23, Matthew 24:30 through 34, and in Revelation 22:7. And I'm going to talk more about the preterist view of the second coming in a minute. But for now, just know that preterists believe that the millennium began in the year 8030 and it ended in 8070 at Jesus' second coming. So, like the Amillennialists, preterists believe the millennium is a symbolic time period. And they believe it lasted 40 years, whereas Amillennialists believe, it's so far 2,000 years and counting. Okay, so which view is correct? What view does the Bible teach? Now, regarding the beginning of the millennium, I think it's pretty easy to figure out. We know from Revelation that Satan is bound at the beginning of the millennium, right? Here's what Revelation said. I read it already, but I'll read it again. "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the keys of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up, put a seal on him so that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years were finished." That's Revelation 20, verse 1 to 3. So Satan is bound at the beginning of the millennium, right? According to Revelation 20. Okay, and moreover, Jesus implied during his earthly ministry that he had bound Satan. If you guys remember, Jesus cast a demon out of a person, and then after then he said that he had bound the strong man, which represents the devil. I'll read the passage. It's Matthew 12, verse 24 to 30. Jesus said, at least in one of the passages, he said, how can one enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man? So in casting out this demon, Jesus had implied he had bound the strong man, the devil, and then was able to cast the demon out. The casting out of the demon was the proof or the sign that Satan had been bound. Now, Jesus also gave this power to bind Satan to his apostles. In Matthew 18:18, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you," and he's talking to his apostles, "whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." This is Matthew 18:18. So Jesus clearly implied that he had bound Satan, during his earthly ministry in the year 8030. So this is when the millennium must have begun per Revelation. So this fits good with the Amillennialist view and the Preterist view. Because remember, the Amillennialists and the Preterists believe that Satan was bound at Jesus' first coming, when he walked the earth. The other two views, Premillennialist and Postmillennialist, they are out of the running. They're disqualified already because they say the millennium has not even begun yet. They put it off in our future somewhere. So I think only the Amillennialist and the Preterist views have, so far are right, could be right. Okay, now a possible objection to this is, how can Satan have been bound, at Jesus' earthly ministry when there's so much evil out there? And my response is, we don't need Satan to be, for there to be evil. The prophet Jeremiah said that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. That's Jeremiah 17:9. Likewise, James said that people are tempted when they are drawn away by their own desires, which leads to sin. You can read that in James 1, verse 14 to 15. So people are quite capable of evil and sin all by themselves. They don't need Satan for that. Another point I want to make is that, if you remember, I just read Revelation 20, and Revelation says that the reason for binding Satan was so that the gospel could go out into the nations. In other words, the gospel had to get firmly established outside of the borders of Judea before the judgment of Jerusalem hit in the year 8070. If you remember, Jesus had prophesied, you can see this in Luke 21, by the way, Jesus had prophesied during his earthly ministry that Jerusalem will be destroyed and the temple would be destroyed. Not one stone will be left upon another. You guys remember that, I'm sure. He said that that judgment would happen within a generation. And this judgment did in fact happen, within a generation by the year 8070. So the gospel message had to be firmly established outside of the region, outside of Judea or Jerusalem before this judgment hit. So this is what the Great Commission was all about, to get the gospel out into the world before this judgment hit. And this task was achieved, by the way. We have biblical proof of this by about the year 8060. This is still about 10 years before the judgment in 8070. So in about 8060, Paul said that the gospel had gone out to all nations. You can read that in Romans 16, verse 26. He also said the gospel had gone out to the ends of the world in Romans 10:18. And he said it had gone out to all the earth in Romans 10:18. Paul also said the gospel had gone out to all the world in Colossians 1:6 and to all creation, Colossians 1:23. So all these statements were uttered by Paul before AD 70, and Paul said the gospel had already gone out to all the world. Now, obviously, he's not, referring to the entire planet. He's referring to the Roman world or the Roman Empire. So the gospel had gone out to all the world, all the Roman world or the Roman Empire before the judgment of Jerusalem hit in AD 70. And by the way, the reason that the gospel could spread so fast throughout the entire Roman world or the Roman Empire is because Satan had been bound. Like Jesus said, he had bound Satan. And because of that, this allowed the gospel to get into all the world before that judgment hit in AD 70. So there's a lot of biblical evidence that the millennium began at Jesus' first coming in AD 30. I've just given two reasons. First, Jesus said he bound the strong man. And then second, Revelation said that the reason Satan was bound so that the gospel can get out to all the nations. And Paul said the gospel had in fact gone out to all the nations. Okay, so now... again, one more thing I'll say. I'll point out again that only the Amillennialist and the Preterist view are possibilities, because the other two, Premillennialist and Postmillennialist, they put the binding of Satan way off in our future still. So those are the only two views that could possibly be true. Amillennialist and Preterist. Okay, so now when does the millennium end? So we know when the millennium began, when Jesus bound Satan, but when does the millennium end? So if we look at Revelation 20, which I just read, after describing the binding of Satan, Revelation goes on to say that at the end of the millennium, the devil will be released for a little while, after which God will send fire from heaven and destroy him and cast him into the lake of fire. So both Amillennialists and Preterists agree that this refers to the second coming, that Satan would be destroyed with fire at the second coming. And in fact, Paul said that Jesus would come in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those who do not know God. You can read that in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 8 and 9. So Paul was describing the second coming, and he said Jesus would come in flaming fire. In other words, he would come in judgment. So the question then becomes, when did Jesus himself say that the second coming would happen? And we don't have to speculate about this because Jesus himself talked about this subject repeatedly. For example, Jesus told the first century disciples, and I already read this passage, but I'll read it again. He told his first century disciples that, assuredly I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death, or who shall not die until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. That's Matthew 16, verse 28. At another time, Jesus told his apostles that they would not finish preaching throughout the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. Now, keep in mind, Israel is about the size of New Jersey, and Jesus said that the apostles would not finish preaching throughout the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes. That's Matthew 10, verse 23. At another time, Jesus told his disciples that they would see him coming on clouds. within a generation. And you can read that in Matthew 24, verses 30 through 34. And keep in mind, the Bible defines a generation as 40 years. You can read that in Hebrews 3, verses 8 through 10, or Numbers 14, verse 30 through 34, or Nehemiah 9:21. So Jesus said that his disciples would see him coming on clouds within a generation, which the Bible defines as 40 years. So the second coming had to have happened by about 80-70, because Jesus, made that comment in about 80-30, and a generation is about 40 years, so that's about 80-70 roughly. So there's just no way around these time statements. And by the way, I know people try to get around these time statements all the time. For example, one passage that's often brought up is that, Jesus said, no one knows the day and hour. Well, fine, no one knows the day and hour, but Jesus certainly knew the generation, because he said it over and over and over, as I just read. In fact, by about the year 8065, Jesus said through an angel in Revelation, he said, "Behold, I'm coming quickly. Do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand." And that's Revelation 22, verse 7 through 10. So by this time in 8065, Jesus said he was coming quickly. So, the coming was about to happen when he said this. And this timing, by the way, lines up perfectly with what Jesus had said back in the year 80-30 during his ministry. Remember, he said during his ministry in 80-30 it would happen within a generation. By the time Revelation was written 35 years later, it was almost at the end of the generation. Jesus now said he's coming quickly, for the time is at hand. So this timing makes perfect sense. It fits perfectly. So Jesus had to come, by the year 80-70 per his own words. Now, by the way, there is some, debate about the dating of Revelation, but I think it's pretty clear that it had to have been written before the temple fell, because Revelation 11, verse 1 and 2 says the temple was still standing and Jerusalem had not been destroyed yet. So it had to have been written before, 80-70, before the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed. For more about this issue, by the way, you can go to my website, thebiblefulfilled.com, and just look up my article called The Dating of Revelation. I get into, I give a bunch of reasons why Revelation had to have been written before 80-70. So again, just go to my website, thebiblefulfilled.com, and then look at my article, The Dating of Revelation. Okay, so the timing of the second coming, according to Jesus, had to happen by about the year 80-70. And by the way, this fits perfectly with the destruction of Jerusalem in 80-70. This is, historians like Josephus tell us that, Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, 1.1 million Jews were killed, another 97 were taken into slavery. So this all happened just like Jesus said. Jerusalem was judged in 80-70. In other words, this is when Jesus came in flaming fire or in judgment against his enemies. This is also when Revelation 20 said that the millennium would end. Remember, as I just read, Revelation says that at the end of the millennium, fire would come from heaven and destroy Satan and his minions and his conspirators. So this all lines up quite well. So only one view of the millennium fits, and that's the Preterist view, which says that, the millennium began at Jesus' first coming in 80-30 and ended at Jesus' second coming in 80-70. So the millennium refers to the 40-year period between Jesus' first and second comings. That's, I think, the biblical conclusion. Now, I want to go over some objections, some common objections to this viewpoint. First one is this: nobody saw Jesus coming in flaming fire in the year 80-70. And my response is this: there are some commentators who say this literally happened, when the Romans burned down Jerusalem and they burned down the temple during the Jewish-Roman War of 80-67 to 80-70. So there are some people that say this literally happened. And, even Josephus writes about, the Romans burning down the temple and burning Jerusalem. So there is some historical evidence for a literal fulfillment. But personally, I don't think this kind of fiery language was intended to be taken literally. After all, God the Father had come in flaming fires many times throughout the Old Testament. For example, the Lord came in a flame of a devouring fire when he judged Assyria in approximately 700 BC. You can read that in Isaiah 30, verse 30. At another time, God the Father came in flaming fire against Israel in 586 BC. You can read about that in Zephaniah 1, verse 18. At another time, God came in flaming fire against David's enemies in approximately 1000 BC. You can read about that in Psalms 18, verse 8. So this flaming fire language is typical judgment language. And it's no different in Jesus's case. At least there's no reason to believe it's, any different. So Jesus came in flaming fire, just like the Bible said in the year AD 70. He came in judgment. That's what, flaming fire refers to, a judgment. Another objection people sometimes raise is that how could Satan have been destroyed when there's so much evil in the world? And I kind of already talked about this in terms of his binding. Just like I said before, that we don't need Satan for there to be evil. I mean, the Bible says people are prone to evil all by themselves in Jeremiah 19:7 or James 1, verse 14 and 15. I already read those a couple minutes ago, so I'm not going to read them again. But we don't need Satan for there to be evil. Second, Revelation itself teaches that there would be evil even after the destruction of Satan, even in the new heaven and earth, which comes after the second coming. In fact, in Revelation 20, after describing the destruction of Satan and the arrival of the new covenant, the new heaven and earth, then Revelation goes on to say, "Blessed are those who do his commandments," and he's talking about God's commandments, and that they might have that they might have the right to the tree of life and may enter through the gates into the city, or the New Jerusalem. But outside are the dogs and the sorcerers and the sexual immoral and the murderers and the adulterers and whoever loves and practices a lie. And this is Revelation 22, verse 14 to 15. So keep in mind, this is after the second coming. This is in the new heaven and earth. This is after the destruction of Satan. And as Revelation says, there are still sinners outside the city or outside the New Jerusalem. And the New Jerusalem, by the way, refers to the church. You can read that in Hebrews 12, verse 22 to 23. I'm not going to look that up, but that's what Hebrews says, that the New Jerusalem refers to the church. So, and again, Revelation says that outside the church, there are, sinners. So, and this is in the new heaven and earth after the second coming, after the destruction of Satan. Another point I want to make is that Isaiah also confirms that there would be sin even in the new heaven and earth, which comes after the second coming. Here's what Isaiah 65, verse 17 and 20 say. "For behold, I create a new heaven and earth," and this is God talking here. "For behold, I create a new heaven and earth, for the child shall die 100 years old, but the sinner, being 100 years, shall be accursed." So this is in the new heaven and earth, and there's still sinners in the new heaven and earth. This is Isaiah 65, verse 17 and 20. One more point I want to make is that Satan's demise in the year AD 70 did not mean his influence suddenly ended. And actually, I heard theologian Don Preston, make this point in one of his videos. I'm not sure which one, but he made the point that Satan, his influence did not suddenly end, when he was killed, any more than Hitler, when he died, any more than Hitler's influence ended when Hitler died. So Hitler died, decades ago, yet his influence is still felt around the world. People still call themselves Nazis and draw swastikas and hate Jews, even though Hitler died a long time ago. And Hitler was just an ordinary man. So how much more would this be the case with somebody of Satan's diabolical stature? So for those reasons, I don't think the objection stands. I don't think it works to say that, there's still evil in the world, so Satan could not have been destroyed. I mean, there's biblical reasons, there's logical reasons. So I don't think that objection stands. Okay, so here's another objection I want to get to now. How could the 1,000 years refer to a mere 40 years? Doesn't the number 1,000 refer to a really long time? And my response is this. First, that the number 1,000 would be meant symbolically in Revelation 20 should not be all that surprising, being that Revelation, is so symbolic. I mean, the whole book of Revelation is symbolic. There's a seven-headed beast in verse 13:1. There's a lamb with 7 eyes in chapter 5, verse 6. There's a woman clothed with the sun, moon, and stars under her feet in chapter 12:1. There's an angel with a chain, as I just read in chapter 20, verse 1, and on and on. So given all the symbolism in Revelation, we should not be surprised that the 1,000 years is symbolic also. Point 2. The Bible repeatedly uses 1,000 to refer to short periods of time. For example, Peter said, with the Lord, 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. This is 2 Peter 3:8. People quote this passage all the time. Another passage, the writer of Psalms says, for the 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday, and your sight is referring to God's sight. So for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, and like a watch in the night. And a watch in the night, by the way, refers to a 3-hour time period. So if 1,000 years can refer to a day or even a watch in the night, which is a 3-hour time period, is it really all that surprising that it would be, that it would refer to a 40-year period in Revelation, the most symbolic book in the Bible, in the New Testament at least? So I don't think 1,000 has to refer to a long period of time. Point 3, many ancient rabbis believe that the millennium would last exactly 40 years. Here is a quote from the book called Behind the Veil of Moses, and this is page 359. It says, quote, older traditions concerning the days of Messiah fix a very short interval for the interim period, which is the millennium, namely 40 years. Similarly, the Qumran materials indicate such a period as, for instance, the Damascus document, which says, quote, from the day of the gathering in of the unique teacher until the destruction of all men of war who turn back with the men of lies, there shall be about 40 years. So this is from an ancient rabbi. Another passage says, this is from a commentary on Psalms 37:10. It says, I will stare at his place and he will no longer be there. Its interpretations concerns all the evil at the end of the 40 years. For they shall be devoured, and upon the earth no wicked person shall be found. This is by Dr. Randall E. Otto in a book called Case Dismissed, Rebutting Charges Against Preterism, page 63. So a lot of ancient Jews believed the millennium would last exactly 40 years. So there's evidence for that. Point 4. Theologian Don Preston cites sources showing that the ancient Hebrews often used extremely large numbers, like 1,000, to describe short periods of great significance. The large numbers magnified the short time period's importance. And in fact, you can even read that, like in Genesis, it said Adam lived to 930 years old. You can read that in Genesis 5, verse 5. Seth lived to 912 years old in Genesis 5, verse 8. And Methuselah lived to 969 in Genesis 5, verse 27. So this kind of, language is used even in the Old Testament. Point 5. Notable Amillennialist G.K. Beale confirms in his commentary on Revelation that early Jews believed that the millennium would last exactly 40 years. And in fact, Beale himself acknowledges that the millennium can be symbolic of a short period of time. This is in that same video I just mentioned, by the way, with Michael Sullivan and Don Preston. Okay, so let's see. Point 6. I have another couple of reasons here. Point 6. The number 1,000 represents completion. And Jesus completed the restoration of mankind's relationship with God during the 40-year period between his earthly ministry in the year AD 30 and his second coming in AD 70. Jesus sacrificed himself for sin at his first coming, and he completed the salvation process at his second coming. Here's what Hebrews 9, verse 26 to 28 say, "But now, once at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself." This was at his first coming. And then it goes on to say, "To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time apart from sin for salvation." And this is the second coming. So Jesus sacrificed himself for sin at his first coming, and he completed the atonement process at his second coming. And by the way, like I just said, the second coming happened 40 years after his first coming, per Jesus. So it's also interesting that none of the patriarchs in the Old Testament lived to age 1,000. You know, like I just mentioned in Genesis, they lived to like 950 or 960, but they never made it to 1,000. Why not? Because the number 1,000 represents perfection and forgiveness of sins and the presence of God. The old covenant system with animal sacrifices could not restore man's broken relationship with God. Hebrews 10:4 says the blood of bulls and goats cannot atone for sin. If they could, then Jesus would not have had to die on the cross. So animal sacrifices were, types and shadows that pointed forward to Jesus's sacrifice and atonement, which could take away sin and restore a man's relationship with God. Therefore, nobody prior to Jesus lived to 1,000 years. However, after Jesus completed the atonement, people finally made it to 1,000. Here's what Revelation says. In, Revelation 20, verse 4, it says, "And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years." So man finally made it back into God's presence because their sins have been forgotten. And by the way, this last point is from a really good book by Timothy Martin and Jeffrey Vaughn called Beyond Creation Science, and this is on page 414. So the 40-year period, that 1,000 years could refer to 40 years is not that big a deal. I mean, there's just evidence all throughout Scripture, and even the ancient Jewish writers say the same thing. So I don't think that objection holds water either. One last objection I want to talk about, and this is more of a question than an objection, but it is the following. When was Satan loosed for a little while? So Revelation 20, verse 3 says that after Satan is bound, he will be loosed for a little while until he was finally, dealt with by God. So if Satan was bound in AD 30, at Jesus's earthly ministry, when was he loosed for a little while? And my response is this. The little while likely refers to the time period of intense persecution of Christians leading up to the Jewish-Roman War of 67 to 70. In fact, Peter said something very telling in the mid-60s, which was, a few years prior to AD 70, which indicates that Satan had been loosed. Here's what Peter says: "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." And remember, Satan had been bound by Jesus back in the year AD 30, and by this time, by AD 60, which is when Peter said this, Satan was once again on the loose. And here's what's interesting too. By this time period, the devil knew his time was short. In Revelation 12:12, which again was written around AD 65, it says the devil knew his time was short. And in fact, Paul too said something similar in Romans, which was written around AD 58. Paul said that Satan would be crushed shortly. So these time statements all fit very nicely with Satan's demise in the year AD 70. All these statements fit perfectly. So I'm going to stop for today. There's much more I could talk about the millennium, and I do in my book called The End is Here, How the New Testament's Prophecies Were Fulfilled. My book should be available for purchase in a couple months, summer 2024. I get into much more detail about these subjects and a whole lot more. So if you want to purchase the book, keep an eye out for that. You can also go to my website, theendishere.com, if you want to preview the book. You can read the introduction at my website, theendishere.com. Also, you can go to my website, thebiblefulfilled.com. If I have a bunch of articles and videos on all kinds of subjects, eschatology and things that we've talked about today, dating Revelation, things like that. And lastly, if you like this video, please hit the like button. It'll make it easier for others to find on the search engines. So thanks again for watching. And thank you also for your positive feedback and all your comments, positive comments that you've been leaving. I really appreciate that. So thanks a lot for that. And again, thanks for watching this video. I will see you the next time. Have a great day or night.